Good evening, dear friends. In this digital age, physical bodies are still pouring into the house, so old-fashioned meetings are still in fashion, it seems. Welcome to this seminar on digital threats towards journalism and journalists. My name is Knut Olav Åmås. I'm Executive Director of the Fritt Ord Foundation, Freedom of Expression Foundation. And I welcome you on behalf of ourselves and the research group Media, War and Conflict at Oslo Metropolitan University, a university which is definitely the leading research and education institution in the field of journalism in Norway, and we are happy to cooperate. Journalism is also one of our foundation's top priorities. And this seminar tonight is in fact the prelude or the very first start of 2-3-day conference at the Oslo Metropolitan University about the digital safety of journalists. Many of you will be talking and or listening in there the next 2 days, Thursday and Friday, and the conference is arranged in connection with UNESCO's International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, which was a day which was last Saturday, wasn't it? 2nd of November. And the conference is set up by and organized by the research group Media, War and Conflict, Fritt Ord, and supported by UNESCO, and the Journalism and Media International Center, and the OsloMet Digital Journalism Research Group. Very long names in Norwegian academic life. But Oslo, as a city, is privileged that you come from all over the world to join these events. Just in the panel tonight, we have guests from the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, from New York, from Rio de Janeiro, and our own city, Oslo. I think the case of the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and the other mega-scale leaks and projects following them, and also minor follow-ups, such as a splendid project called Investigate Europe. All of these show us both the best and the worst of what really becomes possible in the digital age of journalism. The Panama Papers and its followers were coordinated by the outstanding International Consortium for Investigative Journalism, and I think all of these new ways of working have really revitalized faith in important journalism, able to change facts in the world. But they show us at the same time both the best and the worst of what is possible in a digital age. On the positive side, international teamwork, digital means of communication within an extremely comprehensive network of journalists. I'm thinking when I meet people working in the ICIJ, the International Consortium, that there have been and there are so incredibly many moments where something could have gone wrong for the big leak projects, working on them as journalists and editors. Hundreds of journalists in some 90 countries. Just due to the size and volume of it all, so much could have gone wrong, also in terms of digital safety. But it has been, in most ways, a remarkable success. And there is so much to learn, I think, from the ICIJ and its many partners around the world when it comes also to digital safety, because it has been very well protected. And it has been necessary precisely because the moment of publishing makes those who are in the limelight of the journalism starting to remove evidence and protect themselves and call the world's best lawyers. Just because of this, the case of the Panama Papers was published in so many countries at exactly the same time, throwing light on the strengths of this truly global network. But the Panama Papers and its followers also show us the vulnerability of journalists, not least, as one example, with the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia on Malta in October 2017. when she was working with Panama Papers from a Maltese perspective. Let me just add also as a personal note that as a former newspaper editor and now as just an observer of journalism and news publishing houses, that I think there is still very much to be done in many newspapers and other media when it comes to safety, not least digital safety. In fact, it's a miracle that not more damage is done from the outside when one observes the poor levels of security on many insides. Perhaps many of you disagree. You can tell so in the debate afterwards. But I fear you don't disagree. Many journalists' active life on social media and dozens of passwords makes their media outlets also more vulnerable. Just a few weeks ago, we got the news that passwords from 2,700 Norwegian journalists and editors in leading Norwegian media had been publicly exposed after simple hacking. But I think still that working on the big leaks the last decade has been a game changer and also increased security levels inside media houses. And as a former editor myself, I know that from experience that when just a little bit too many know about a project inside a media house, it gets more and more difficult to keep it secret during the process. And editors are worse than ordinary journalists. For many years, we have been used to regard the internet and digital transformation as a culture of freedom, and it is. It has given us so much high-quality journalism, which was unthinkable some decades ago, and social media also that enlarges democracy. But during the last few years, we have also been reminded of the fact that digital technology is a technology of surveillance, control, and censorship, and for manipulation of news and facts. So without getting too pessimistic, at least not from the start, we welcome the debate of acknowledging the realities of both sides of technology, and we have the goal of finding, I think, practical solutions and sound strategies against digital threats to journalists and journalism. That's it. Now I have the pleasure of handing over the rest of the seminar to our moderator, Ms. Heidi Taksdal Skjeseth, a journalist and an author herself, and one of the previous recipients of Fritt Ord's Journalism Fellowship at the excellent Reuters Institute in Oxford. Please, Heidi.
Thank you, Knut Olav, and thank you everybody for being here. We have a particularly fantastic panel here tonight, and loads of people, so I think this will be a very interesting and important night. I will not speak for long. I will just introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. That's Guy Berger. He's here, the director for freedom of expression at UNESCO. He's a journalist, a media activist himself from South Africa, and he will give you, or us, a global overview over this, the digital safety for journalists. And then afterwards, I'll introduce our panel.
congratulations to the university for the 5th conference. This really takes dedication, resources, effort, and conscience. Really, congratulations. And congratulations also to Knut and your institute, Fritt Ord. And the UNESCO National Commission here in Norway. What I'm going to try and do in this presentation is not go through the details. I'm going to try and help us unpack what we mean by digital safety, because it sounds simple, but it's more complicated perhaps than we think. And in essence, this is my proposal that I'm hoping I can sell you. Disentangle the problems, defend and defy, and do more research. And I say do more research because many of you here are academics, and we are here because of this conference. Very simple message, please remember. At UNESCO, we do a report called The World Trends in Freedom of Expression and Media Development. And in fact, OsloMet is a great partner in having events around the world to have dialogue around this report. Now, I had some copies there, but probably they are gone already, but you can find it online. And it's very interesting because in 2018, the report then tracked these kinds of digital threats, which I won't read, but you can see on the screen. And already, when we did one this year, we said, oh, there's been a change which needs to be taken into account. These are manipulating the flow of information to bury or distract from journalistic content, and to manipulate journalists into circulating unverified content. So we see it's a very dynamic space, and what's coming next? Certainly people, I'm sure you've heard in the realm of cyber warfare, people speak about lethal autonomous weapons systems, LAWS. Are we going to see lethal autonomous weapons systems being used against journalists in one form or another? So we have to watch the space, but we have to try and understand what we mean by it. So until I started preparing this PowerPoint, this is the model of safety I and my colleagues at UNESCO were using, and many other people. And we developed this model because with the rise of digital, we saw, okay, we need to add digital into this picture. Because, of course, the world is digitalizing. You know, there's digitalization of agriculture, of health, of education, and of media, and of warfare. So that's why we added this third circle there. But it's more complicated, as I hope to show. So just at the basic understanding level, we can say the physical, it's to cause harm or to put obstacles in the way of journalists doing their job. I was in Uganda last week. The journalists are reporting police action against the students, and of course the journalists get beaten and pushed out of the way so they cannot report on what's happening. So that's the physical realm. Psychological, and especially genderized, you know that, I'm sure the people here, forcing people out of the profession out of fear, and particularly pressure on women. Causing digital harm, well, what do we mean by that? And up to now, I was thinking we need to think of it as digital infrastructure. But now I'm not so sure. And I'm going to tell you why I think all this model becomes more complicated. First of all, physical harm, it's not just intended to get a journalist out the way. It's intended to create a psychological effect as well. So you kill a journalist, but it's also to intimidate their colleagues. Except sometimes the opposite happens. This is not always behavioralism. As in the case of Daphne Galizia, she gets killed, and then journalists come together and they say, we're not going to accept this, we carry on with her story. So psychological, it's not always the exact consequence of the physical. And indeed, psychological doesn't always lead to fear, it leads sometimes to reaction. Do we understand that? I'm not sure. So coming to now what we mean by digital safety and digital harm. So if we take that thing of digital infrastructure, we could say seizure of digital equipment, because of course when a phone is seized, it's much more than just seizing a camera on the spot. It's got the journalist's entire contact list on the phone and so on. Disruption of connection. This is actually something that's coming up very much now. DDoS attacks, blocking, filtering, internet cutoffs, surveillance. Surveillance, I think, is bringing us close to the question of intelligence gathering for an attack, as you see in real warfare, by which I mean kinetic warfare, spyware and profiling. So that's one way of understanding these digital harms. But as I've been hinting, I think we've got to go a little bit further than this, because in that first model, if you remember, it's physical, psychological, digital. What was in common? These are the targets of attacks. But there's weapons. And so when you talk about online abuse, is this a digital attack? Yes or no? Let me ask you. Online abuse, is that a digital attack? Yes. Okay, I say no, because the target is not digital. The target is psychological. It aims to deter journalists from coverage. The aim is to create self-censorship. Okay? So strictly speaking, if we're going to differentiate safety in terms of targets, then we have to say, digital attack, are we going to be consistent and say the target must be digital? So what damages digital capacity? And therefore, it's to censor as opposed to self-censor. Okay? You bear with me where I'm going. However, in this thinking, that if we think about targets and weapons, where do we put in surveillance, and what about tampering of content? Are they weapons? Are they targets? Is it a means? Is it an end? This becomes quite complicated, and these are things that are, of course, super enabled by the digital world. And also what complicates this thing is that even if you said digital is the digital infrastructure, it's also something that can cause physical harm and psychological harm. I hate to give this example, but how was Daphne Caruana Galizia killed? Does anybody know? Car bomb. How was a car bomb triggered? Cell phone. So I think we could recognize the digital aspects are not only an end infrastructure, but they can also be a means to cause psychological and bodily harm. And so we can say that digital gets exploited as a vector or a vehicle that intensifies the harms on the body and the mind via trolling, automation, orchestration, and triggers. People are organizing attacks on journalists using this. So I would call these digitally mediated attacks. Therefore, if we stick with this model for the moment, still, these are using the word digital to refer not to the mind or the body, but to the means. And so it's digitally mediated attacks. And so, of course, you all know these things, smears and disinformation, discrediting, doxing, coordinating and committing these attacks. So just pause on that a bit and think of where I'm going. And I'll tell you in a minute, because I think if we try and take an account of what digitalization means for the safety of journalists, it's a combination of means and ends. It's a combination of object, the target, and it's also the vehicle. So we need to start seeing them together holistically. I think this time in history where we'll see digital as something different, something separate, it becomes slightly problematic. So it's still distinctive, however, but if you look at intimidation, it still happens at political rallies. Journalists are subjected to there's incitement for mobs to attack journalists, but now it's on scale. Aggression, we know aggression is far easier in the online environment because people feel much less inhibited. We know that digital enables all these unpleasant elements to come into the system and to try and drown out and sometimes discredit journalists and journalism. We know that the mob's right to association is now abused to associate for purposes that violate rights. And we also know finally that you have this business model on the internet, which means that news is already being penalized, even leave aside the attacks. But it means that the playing field is skewed towards those who are not friends of journalism, put it that way. So this is part of the complicated situation, which shows to me that we've got far more of an interpenetration, interdependence, even integration of digital and non-digital dimensions of safety. But here's my new model. If we stick with the targets, then I think we can split the physical into two different parts. Physical is bodily harm, which could be caused by digital, such as that example of triggering a car bomb with a cell phone. It could be infrastructural, which could be physical, it could be digital. Okay. And then on the right-hand side, we can put the modality of the attacks, which can be done by digital or non-digital, or in combination. And the point here, I think that today we can recognize that digital really ramps up the game. It brings in a powerful new means of attack, because it's also potentially an object of attack as well. So I think once we start thinking in this way, we can think of digital dimension being much bigger, digital safety, than just safety in the more narrow sense, because we have to defend all these different aspects. And then we come to these other dimensions that I touched on earlier. Where does surveillance fit in? Surveillance, as I said, I think we have to see this as part of the wider picture now. It's intelligence gathering. And then you have disinformation, which is the other new part of this equation, which is not only harming journalists, and sometimes particular journalists, also harming society. And it does this kind of broad damage to particular journalists, but to the notion of journalism, to the brands of journalism with imposter brands, the genre of journalism when it's being manipulated. So this is the kind of conceptual stuff that I wanted to just problematize a bit, so that we think a bit more, because it's very easy to say physical, psychological, digital. But actually we're living in a time when everything is becoming digital, but of course kinetic, physical has that other dimension. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I want to switch to a slightly more positive note now, because if we're speaking about disentangling the problem in a sophisticated way, there's different kinds of offenses and defenses that operate at different levels. And there's actually some good news here, but before I come to that, I'm going to unpack these slightly, but not spend too much time on it. You can see from the list on the screen the different ways I've unpacked this. So I'm going to skim through this, but I'll stop at some key points. Individual newsroom level. Often when people speak digital security, this is the only thing they think about. But we can't only think about this. We also have to think about these other levels that I'll come to in a minute. But here I would just signal out the hashtag of this year's Impunity Day campaign, Keep Truth Alive, which is in the middle of these. This is really an imperative now for journalists to do this. If you're going to defend and offend against these attacks, you've got to pay attention to the Keep Truth Alive. Then I come to the media owners and managers, and you'll see a picture here of a book that UNESCO published a little while ago. And basically, media owners and managers, they have a duty to their employees. And they have to have a policy on safety. They have to ensure training. They have to be gender sensitive, trauma sensitive. They also need to understand the overview of the internet. And I'll come back to that in a second. They need to protect the infrastructure against DDoS attacks, for example. By the way, they also need to protect the officers. When Jeffrey Epstein barges into the New York Times to try and bully the journalist who are about to expose his abuse of women, you actually need security at the door that's going to stop Jeffrey Epstein from doing that. And they have to advocate also. I mean, too many media owners and managers are passive in the face of these issues. There's also, I see Julie Possetti in the background there, author of this book, Protecting Journalism Sources. We have the whole value chain. So again, when we think in digital safety in particular, we can't only think journalists, we have to think of their sources. And it's not just this question of the journalists having encrypted information and secret channels, it's also legal protection. And encryption then becomes a policy question. In other words, you as a journalist or as a media owner, you can't simply think that you're doing your job. You've got to engage in these bigger social debates. Blocking and filtering of content and apps, again, connectivity cutoffs, again. So I'm sorry to tell you, journalists who are here, you have to become all-round activists in a lot of these things. Societal level, just to touch on here. Media and information literacy, I think you know about this, and long overdue and in need of a lot of push. What is digital literacy? Do we teach society about encryption? Do we teach society how to use VPNs, where they're legal? And what about mesh networks? I won't go into that. Disinformation literacy. But in particular, there's a particular subspecies of media and information literacy. Who's doing what in that space? State level, I think this is fairly obvious what governments need to do. Some of them, unfortunately, are culprits rather than part of the solution, especially in the bottom one there. So that was about states need to respect rights. Here they need to protect rights. These are some of the ways, and I won't spend time. Rule of law. This impunity is unbelievably bad. 9 out of 10 cases of killings of journalists are not solved. Now, look at all the other kinds of attacks that are not dealt with either, but the most, the capital crime is not being resolved. Stronger judicial systems. UNESCO has been training judges in Africa and Latin America. Security forces also need to be trained, and prosecutors. Not to spend time on this now, but you can see the states cannot dodge their responsibility, just as media owners and media managers cannot. So this is important now for the digital age. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just to signal, there's a full chain of internet actors here, all of whom have a part to play in this digital safety issue. There are 5 intermediary types here. And sometimes we don't remember that each of them is potentially a place for leaks, a place for sabotage, a place for espionage, a place that's not friendly to the safety of journalists. If you look at those, device makers, operating systems, connectivity providers, security providers, Cloudflare, anybody? Application providers, and then you've got all these application providers, which is a whole, how many apps do you have on your phone? Probably at least 5, if not 20, if not 30. So there's a huge chain there that also needs to be looked at in terms of digital safety. These internet companies, which I don't like to call platforms because it implies that they're just a simple neutral platform, they need to start doing serious human rights assessments and so on. And I'm not going to go into this, but I do commend this too. There's a model that UNESCO is promoting for the internet, which is called Rome. Rights, openness, accessible, multi-stakeholder. And, well, I don't have time to go into it, but if we can promote an ecosystem with the internet that is respecting rights, that is open, that is accessible, that is multi-stakeholder governed, then I think we're onto some way towards combating this. Then I come to the normative level, because remember I had all these levels. Normative level, this is the good news. There is increasing concern registered. It gets up there into the UN. So you've got this UN plan of action on the safety of journalists since 2012. And it keeps growing and involving more people. You have a UN plan of action on hate speech now. Hate speech being much broader than journalists, but often journalists are caught up in that. In the UN system, there have been 13 resolutions in quite a short space of time. So I should also just mention, this is important about the importance of safety of journalists, but they contested. The norms are changing, believe me. Don't take it for granted that the UN is forever going to be doing this. 3 decisions at UNESCO's Council. As we speak, the states in New York are debating a new resolution on safety of journalists. If you've never looked at these resolutions, they are very, very interesting, and they should be used in terms of promoting safety of journalists in an all-round way. Interestingly, here it's recognized the UN Secretary General made a report this year. He spoke about the digital rights. This is the first time that actually that's been mentioned. So there's, getting to that system, it's getting through that digital is the issue. Now I come to the really good news about those are the different levels. I'll tell you a bit about the actors fighting back in those different levels. So who here has heard of Maria Ressa? Okay, if you haven't heard of her, she's well worth looking up. And this is a picture of an article done by Julie Passetti, showing how this incredible Filipino journalist was way ahead of the curve in terms of exposing orchestrated disinformation. She exposed that there were 3 super trolls in the Philippines who had 36 sock puppet fake accounts who reached 3 million people in the Philippines and were responsible for Duterte's successful election. As a result of her exposing this, she became a victim. The kind of threats that she started getting were like this. I wish Maria Ressa would be raped to death. She was getting more than 60 of these kinds of abuses a minute. So she's pushed back because she's holding the line. In fact, she pushed back so well that the lack of success in deterring her, in intimidating her, has meant that other tactics are being used against her. Now, legal tactics. She's facing 3 or 4 law cases, which could put her in prison. And the offline abuse continues, and it could jump into, the online abuse continues and could jump into offline. Don't worry about that. Now she has to walk around with a bodyguard. But she refuses to take this like this, and she's continuing on the backs of the internet companies. She cannot report abuse. You know, you have this opportunity to report abuse. She cannot report abuse when she's getting this avalanche of stuff. The companies themselves need to step up. Then there's also this growth of alliances under this UN plan of action. So you can see there's different groupings here, and I won't go into them except to mention the bottom one, academia. Because here you can see academia, Journalism Safety Research Network. Please join us if you're an academic. Annual Conference on the Safety of Journalists, Oslo Metropolitan University. It's really important that each of these stakeholders really gets its act together. You can see there's stuff happening, judiciary, media organizations, UN, member states, and so on. It's not enough, but this is real advance. I can see it within the system. Okay, so begin to wrap up now. I've spoken about disentangling, the defiance, the defense. Now we need the data. And so the UN Human Rights Council has called for more monitoring, more data. This is an open invitation to you, the academics. The UN Secretary General calls for collaboration of the civil society organizations, which encompasses academia here. UNESCO is monitoring killings of journalists. If you look at this incredible map, it's just mind-blowing because you can drill down to these countries. Who's killed and which cases have been resolved. But it's killings. Now, you've heard of the SDGs, I hope, Sustainable Development Goals. So they have an indicator to measure progress towards sustainable development. And it's not only killings, it covers these other things, kidnappings, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, torture. And it also includes other harmful acts, of which we now have a range, and Maria Ressa can tell you only too well about those. So this is an opportunity for people to use something that's got UN kind of approval and do research, particularly at country level, because it's very hard for UNESCO at national level to monitor all these other things. But at country level, you can do fantastic research, monitoring enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, torture, and these other harmful acts. So UNESCO has produced a more detailed template how one could go about doing this research in these other areas. And there's a civil society group in Latin America, 8 countries. They mapped safety of journalists, digital and non-digital dimensions, and they made a shadow report which they used for advocacy during the UN review of SDGs this year. In countries like Iraq, we're using this process to really get some momentum on this. So I'm going to wrap up now and to say that what I'm trying to convey to you is that the reality, of course, we know this thing's all mixed up. It's only an academic abstraction to say what's physical, psychological, digital, and so on. But it's important because that's how we can understand that things are moving all the time here. And we have to get to grips with what's distinctive. And I think one thing that we can begin to see, just as digitalization affects the whole of society, so everybody, apart from those people who want to violate rights, they have a direct stake in press freedom, because to publish on Facebook, is press freedom. To tweet is press freedom. Everybody's got a stake in connectivity, even if it's just for keeping in touch with their family or education. Encryption and reliable information and safety. So the potential for widespread alliances is really big. It's not just journalists who are in this boat, it's everybody now. And so I think it's important to look at how we can get wider public resilience and resolve, and how those active agents in those constituencies can also drive the defenses that are unique to journalism, such as protection of sources, confidentiality, and not get into the debate about who is a journalist, which I don't think is particularly productive at this point. So if we understand the anatomy of attacks, then we could say we are facing a kind of war of attrition. I don't like using war as a metaphor like war of drugs, but what's useful here is to use this idea of attrition. It's slow and it's across many, many fronts, so it's multi-fronted. And it's not only on the press, it's also on the progress. It's on science, fundamentally, and verified information. So, yes, we've got to strengthen journalism through stronger journalism, more quality journalism, more inclusive journalism, more honest journalism, but it's not enough. We need the shields and we also need the spears. And the spears have to include organizing, such as, for example, editors are using WhatsApp groups to monitor and react quickly to threats to journalists, exposing, especially exposing orchestrated attacks and to give voices against those efforts that are whittling away the norms that actually a journalist should work without fear. We have to strengthen alliances and we have to expand the research. I think maybe your idea next year, Kristen, is to say, let's look at resistance to the threats to safety and find these good practices, because there are good practices. Still not enough, but there is something there. The situation could be way, way worse, I hate to tell you. That's the video I showed at the beginning. It could, you've seen the tip of what could face us. If you academics do get more involved in this, don't think that you yourselves are just ivory tower observers. I think some of you know Thomas Hanich. His wonderful research project has been hacked. So expect that once you get in this game, which you need to, you put yourself up as a target as well. In addition to this conference that's taking place tomorrow, there's also the World Press Freedom Day, which will be in the Netherlands, 22 to 24 April. There'll be an academic conference on safety. Please consider taking forward some of the research here, bringing new research, mobilizing your academic colleagues. An academic called Mark Doyge is coordinating this in the Netherlands. Some of you will know him. And I think if we kind of can keep this momentum, then indeed we can help keep truth alive. Thank you very much.